All right, fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the May 26th, 2026 Municipal Financial Recovery Advisory Committee meeting. I am VJ Kapoor. I serve as the receiver for the City of Chester. Joining us today are several members of the MFRAC committee, Councilman Shaquan Davis, Ms. Kelly Diaz from Delaware County, and Mr. Andrew Sheaf from DCD. The mayor should be on in just a little bit. Also joined here today by my special assistant, Jacob Polikov, and my executive assistant, Mr. Cody Deal. So good afternoon, everybody. Also, very happy to be joined today, who we'll be getting to in just a moment, is Dr. Christopher Melee from the University of Buffalo, who serves as a senior researcher at the Lang Center at Swarthmore, and is going to be talking with us today. I'm very excited about his book that he wrote back in 2017 called "Race and the Politics of Deception." Dr. Melee has researched Chester for quite a long time. I think most of us on this committee have read his book, and we're really excited to have him on to talk about the history of Chester and his research into it. So, before we get to Dr. Melee, let's just take care of some administrative things. Mr. Deal, any public comment that we've received?
Thank you, Mr. Receiver. So we have not received any public comments for the committee. So as always, would just like to encourage the public to reach out to us. Again, as always, the best way to do so is through our resource account email address, which is info@chesterreceivership.com. That's info@chesterreceivership.com. Again, there wasn't any comments for the committee, but I think we may have gotten some feedback on our guest today, which we can elaborate on further.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we got a couple questions that I have here that I will see if I can work into as we go along. So again, before we get to Dr. Melee, I don't have really much else for the committee here. It's been a relatively busy couple of months in Chester. Fair amount of legislation that has been passed by City Council, by the mayor as well, and including the mayor. So we'll have more of an update on that, I think, in the coming weeks. We really wanted to spend some time kind of learning a little bit more about the history of Chester. We have sort of what I would refer to as a pretty diverse audience in that watches these MFRACs. Folks who are from Chester, who grew up in Chester, who know Chester. We got a couple of those individuals on the committee as well. Folks who are not from Chester, but who have spent a fair amount of time working in and around it. A fair number of those folks on this call as well, and some people who are, either part of the bankruptcy or others who are, just sort of learning about Chester and learning about the history, and so I think what Dr. Melee will have today for everybody will appeal to everybody. So without further ado, let me get into it. Dr. Melee, you can put yourself off mute. But just wanted to kind of start with a little bit of a background here. I mean, I know it's not a job interview, but tell us a little bit about your background here, how you got interested in the city of Chester.
Sure. So I'm a sociologist, and my particular area of focus is cities, urban sociology. I started my career focusing on New York City, primarily the Lower East Side, which was the immigrant portal for the United States from 1850 to about 1950. And at the time, the area in the late 90s and 2000s was undergoing massive gentrification from being a working class, at that time, mostly Latino and artist-based community, into a middle class gentrified area. And I was focusing on on how developers and the city administration used the reputation of the area as downtrodden, as immigrant based and working class, and kind of twisted it in a very clever way to sell it. So my book is called Selling the Lower East Side. That's my first book. That I focus on the use of cultural symbols and reputation to sell a neighborhood. The Lower East Side was never going to be Greenwich Village or the Upper East Side. So, in a clever way, downtown grunginess was sold as a form of capital. So that's where I started, and I've kind of continued on this theme of how a place reputation, how people, folks largely learn about a community through the media, particularly, shapes some of its development patterns. And in the book on on Chester, I do a similar thing, focusing on the outsider representation of Chester through the course of the 20th century as being utilized, if not manipulated, by local political leaders and developers eventually, and industries to basically make money. So my book is a little bit more than that, but that's my general thread. So I am at the University of Buffalo full time, but I also work as a research fellow at the Lang Center and work with some of the students who are interns in Chester City, working with various organizations like Chester Education Foundation, the Receiver's Office, as a few. My recent work is primarily on storytelling. So it's rather than talk about how Chester is understood from the outside in, I'm interested now in how folks in Chester create a counter narrative to the story of Chester as this downtrodden, problem-laden city, and showing really the focus on resilience within the communities itself. So that's where the kind of thread of things are. Usually, when I write a book about a place, once the book is published, I leave and I'm done with it. Uh, Chester, however, kind of stuck with me. Quite obviously, I continue to work there, even though the book came out, as Vijay mentioned, in 2017. So I feel grateful to be able to participate in research with and collaborate with folks in the community. It's been a great learning process for me. A lot of what's in the book has been counter claimed by folks within the community based on their own personal histories and personal experiences, which is great. And I expected it to be so. So.
Yeah, great. Well, Dr. Bailey, so you actually grew up not too far away from here, right? Like you were in Delaware, and you kind of had a just you knew a little bit about the city, right? Growing up, or at least some of the things that people said about the city growing up.
Yeah, I grew up in North Wilmington, in a suburb off of Route 202, which many of us know. And as a teenager and young adult, the reputation of Chester was a place to avoid, a place to keep away from, a place that really is suffering intractable problems, and especially around the much trumped up, and I'll talk about that later, idea of Chester as a site of rampant criminal activity. So that's my original, understanding of it. Much later on, as my parents aged, and I did a little bit of, caretaking in their senior years, the casino opened, and no big surprise, older folks like casinos. Uh, does anyone else like casinos? Well, slot machines in particular. In any event, I took my mother there a couple times, and I have no interest, so I drove around, and that really got me started with like what's going on here, especially along the waterfront. So my first foray was an article about the waterfront in an urban sociology journal, talking about the mixed use sounds a little too quaint. Mixed use is along the waterfront, which we all know includes the casino, the prison, eventually the soccer stadium that wasn't built at the time, the uh, the incinerator, the other incinerator for the Delco Sewer Authority. So it really was a mixed bag, and it struck me as very odd. And so that really set me on track and kind of coincidentally, my mother wanting to go to Chester Casino, it had recently opened, became the way in which I got involved. That's typical, I think, for most people that do my work. You get caught up on something and try to figure it out.
Great. Well, before we get into the book and talk about sort of the history, I wanted you to just touch on one more area here. So you basically help run, or I think do run, the Chester semester in the Lang Center. Can you let folks know kind of what that is, and kind of how that's integrated into the city?
Yeah, the Chester semester used to be just one semester at Swarthmore College, but now it's a full year. It's based on two components. One is the fall course about Chester, which I work with the students to on a seminar situation, and we bring in invited guests, community partners from Chester, a great number of them over a course of about 10 weeks. We also do a lot of reading about Chester's history and current situation, and that simultaneously students begin working internships as well, year long, in various, again, social service organizations, nonprofits, and grassroots advocacy. And so that works for about a year that they're there. So that goes along quite well. It's been around for about 10 years. All right, we just did the 10th year. I've taught it twice. I'm about to teach it again in the fall.
Great, great. So Chris, again, so let's go through it again for those who are sort of joining this. The book that Chris wrote here was Race and the Politics of Deception: The Making of an American City. Dr. Mather, can you tell us a little bit about the kind of political history of Chester? Like what is sort of different about Chester than what a lot of other communities that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, the one striking thing about Chester is that it's not unique, that it had a very sophisticated political machine, which is essentially a mechanism that was developed in the late 19th century in cities across the United States to basically muster, for most part, immigrant communities' votes in exchange for some basic services like streets cleaning, police presence, and things of that nature. And in return, creates this kind of mechanism in which a political power maintains its power through uh, basically nepotism, corruption of various sorts. Again, Tammany Hall in New York City was a big one. Mayor Daley, a little bit later on in Chicago. These are kind of known machines. Most of them kind of fade away eventually. What is unique about Chester is two things. One is the length of the machine from about 1875 formally to 1965, but we'll talk about that 1965 date is not all that important. That's when the McClure, John McClure, who ran the machine, passed away. And then the second thing is that most machines were neighborhood based, if not urban based, and then faded away. Uh, the machine in Chester is unique in that it also reached its tentacles and then essentially moved its power base from Chester into Delaware County proper. So the suburbanized suburban machine is one thing that is somewhat relevant and well, it's incredibly relevant to not only the past but the present of Chester politics. So, I mean, I can talk. I'll just give you a real quick run through of the machine. John McClure, which many of you are, I'm sure that name sounds familiar, who ran his office out of I think the building that the receiver you're sitting in right now on the top floor. Uh, and basically had a great view of the expanse of the city. Mr. McClure came into power in 1907. The machine itself was a little bit earlier, but kind of percolated along. Mr. McClure was a genius, quite frankly, in the political development of his power base, helped along by a number of things and unfortunate ones. For example, a riot that took place in Chester in 1917 created a situation of hardened neighborhood segregation based on black and white. And the idea of Mr. McClure then, as a machine, was getting votes within the black community by creating two things. One is protection against further violence, and second, to allow the economy within the black community, mostly on the West End, to develop. And so this kind of creates a situation in which the machine has anchored itself in the community. So if you want to have a job in the school district, if you want to have a job at Sunship, if you want to have a job in the city in maintenance or in the police department or anything for that matter, you had to go through the machine. And that required sort of paying dues primarily by voting. So this creates this anchored system in which you have uh, not the political machine as for most of us, like City Hall is something somewhat abstract. It's the power. You can't fight City Hall. It's this kind of entity. Here you see a situation in which the local politics is infused in everything that you do. If you want to open a shop, if you want to have a department store, if you want to rechange zoning, all of this has to get filtered through the mechanism of the political machine. That again has happened in other cities, but Mr. McClure was genius in kind of focusing on the racial divide within Chester City after that riot to build a kind of a tight organization that controlled all of these things in terms of rewards, business practices, etc. This kind of continues on. The one thing, as I already mentioned, was that Mr. McClure decided to expand the machine control formally into the suburbs of mostly rural at that point, Delaware County, and creates this what's called the War Board, which connects local Republican leaders throughout different municipalities and townships in Delaware County to the actual political machine. And so everything becomes coordinated. The who is put up for election, judges, sheriff, etc. All that becomes kind of formally included in the operation of the machine. So the extent of power goes into uh, the Delaware County. So Mr. McClure, as I mentioned, dies in March of 1965, and ordinarily you would think that would be the end of the machine. Most cities, machines ended somewhat earlier, 1940s, the early 1950s, as part of a kind of good government movement to try to put transparency and shed light on a lot of practices that municipal politics were engaged in, and also generational change, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. But no, that doesn't happen because of the power basis is in been expanded into Delaware County. So what is unique about Chester, and we really can't underemphasize that enough, is that the control is moved to the suburbs. And eventually, by the 1960s, the power center, geographical power center, moves from Chester City to Media and surrounding communities within Delaware County. This creates a situation where you have then eventually some fragmentation of what I call kind of a fiefdom situation, where you have little orbits of power and control over your particular geographical zones within Delaware County, Chester being one of them. Now, what also takes place that is incredibly different and has long-standing ramifications is that usually political machines work in this kind of handshake agreement with the community that they're situated in. We give you garbage service, we give you these types of municipal service. In exchange, you vote for us. Basically, the idea that the community gets something through the corruption, the nepotism, the patronage that occurs to the machine. What you begin to get in the early 1970s in Chester is an inverted version of that. Rather than the machine benefiting in some way or another everyday life in Chester City, it begins a system of extraction. That is, the power base based in Delaware County begins to suck out literally resources, capital, brain power, everything to pull out that which existed in Chester City into the surrounding community for the benefit of the suburbs. So this, those of us who've been studying this, or those of you who have lived here, know this distinction between city and suburb, between Chester and Delaware County. This becomes somewhat hardened. And so Chester becomes quite clearly a space to extract from, to make money from, but not to benefit the folks that live there. It becomes a way of funneling, for example, a lot of money that was coming from the federal government through HUD, through other federal agencies, somewhat connected to the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson. That money becomes cleverly funneled into the coffers of the political elites and their cronies, and sidetracked from what its intended purpose was. We know that, for example, with the situation of the housing authority, and as just one clear example. So that becomes the situation of and I describe it in my book as parasitical, that the host is Chester and the machine, which is now still fully involved in Chester City, becomes the center is within the county and begins this process of pulling things out, pulling money out.
And Dr. Melly, if I could just stop you there, because there's a passage in your book, because I wanted to sort of bring into like some of the specific examples of what that looks like, right? Because we're talking, and so this is from page 60 of your book to 61. Chester's political machine laid the systemic framework for whites to exit Chester and to avail themselves of residential opportunities and the security of an intact racial order, which were both available in nearby suburban towns and villages. As whites moved into newer housing in the small towns that dotted Delaware County, they often held on to their Chester properties, dividing them into rooming houses or apartments for black tenants with the consent of the McClure machine. I mean, one of the things that we see, because part of I know what we'll talk a little bit about is how that legacy is still impacting us today, right? One of the things that we see in Chester that I think is of particular interest is that just the number of folks who are living in rental properties here as opposed to home ownership, right? And how many of those people who own these homes um, do not live in Chester, right? They're in New Jersey, they're in Delaware County, they're in elsewhere. Not to say there aren't folks who don't own properties in Chester, but I think it's about two-thirds, Mayor, if I'm right, about two-thirds of the city residents are in rental properties as opposed to a third. And much of that is again, many of those owners don't live in the city. Is that kind of like, one of those examples, Dr. Melee, of what you would sort of point to as the extraction?
Yeah, most definitely. The control of land, the control of resources remained intact in primarily white business owners, white residents, as you mentioned. However, they're no longer present within Chester City itself. So it becomes, again, the source of a pipeline of monies that can be made, again, either directly through things like rental income or indirectly through subsidies from the federal government for rental income that that flow outward, not inward, and remain within the city itself. The part of that, in terms of, you mentioned that passage which speaks to race, that where that comes into play is that the uh, important component of this is that the blame for this, the understanding, the explanation as to why this is happening is through the media and political elites focused on the residents themselves. That is, through a process of misrepresentation, focusing on stereotypes present at the time and continue today, and stigma, that this idea that the residents are responsible for this stark downturn that you're seeing in the fortunes of the city. But meanwhile, the documentary evidence that is primarily from uh, organizations like the former Pennsylvania Crime Commission show that the levers of power and control are still within the political machine. So you have bail bonds schemes that are going on. So that accounts for an accelerated arrest rate that people then in Delaware County are saying, see, the city is full of crime. They're blaming it on the folks that are purportedly engaging in the crime. However, there's a whole system intact that gets exposed by the federal government of kind of forced arrests for loitering and things of this nature. So it bumps up crime stats. So you have a lot of extra legal criminal operations that are at play that are sanctioned, if not controlled directly, but definitely benefited by external players. But the blame for the demise of that, the outcome of it, is placed squarely on the shoulders of the residents themselves. And so this is again where place identity and representation kind of play into the fortunes of a city, because for again, living myself included, living in nearby Delaware, the reputation of Chester is a place to avoid. The understanding explanation as to what's actually going on is not. Right. So
Yeah.
that's I think a key part of it.
Yeah, so I interrupted you. So we were going past McClure in 65, right? I think you were getting into the 70s under McCrelly and can you sort of take us through there and get us to kind of, modern day here as the machine and its legacy kind of continue.
Yeah, so the fiefdom approach is really kind of creates some competition. Each fiefdom is kind of based on its fortunes within its own local community. In the case of Chester, as I mentioned, you have still the business ownership and land ownership being controlled mostly by white folks who, some of whom formerly lived there, but no longer were doing so. So, what were some of the ways in which they could create um, means of capital? And so, there's a number of things. The waterfront, the Crowley from prison, kind of dips his toes into the waste management system and creates the beginnings of what we eventually have as a waste magnet, putting the word out to Philadelphia and surrounding communities that this is the place to bring your to bring your garbage for it to be processed. A lot of that is what happens in building up into the 70s and in the 80s. Um, and you have this kind of creation of, again, this despair narrative that occurs, a decline narrative that occurs within the city. Um, a lot of what transpires in the 1980s and 1990s is not well documented, unfortunately. A lot of the PA commissions, the human relations commissions, the Pennsylvania Crime Commission, which I rely on, their documents from my book, are no longer producing these reports or no longer in existence. So there you have basically the residents can provide the best explanation as to those days in the 80s and 90s about things like the William Penn homes and things of that nature, the decline that was there. But what it does create, and if I may, I wanted to speak about this, is the aftermath. So you have this fragmented political machine that operates. Um, but you doesn't technically operate any longer, but it produces what political scientists refer to as a political culture. And the political culture is not only the kind of governance that we have, whether it be accountable or not accountable, or corrupt or not corrupt, but it also includes the citizens as well and their view of government and how they perceive how government works and affects their everyday life. And typically, you have some level of alignment or misalignment. You don't trust City Hall is an example of misalignment. But in Chester, you had an unfortunate kind of nihilistic version of political alignment in the political culture between a routinely corrupt governance with a pessimism amongst the population about what they can get and they can expect from their city. So political culture is really kind of intangible, but it's real. The shared values, the norms, the beliefs about what your politics and your attitudes about politics within a city. And people begin to understand that this is how things get done, that corruption becomes somewhat normalized. The ethics question is always there, but it's not seen as rising to the top. The only time things begin to change in that or alignment rather, is from external sources when the federal government or the state government shines light on what's going on in Chester City. That can become a bit of a problem for that alignment. But this public cynicism begins to continue, and it creates a kind of a moral gray zone in which people operate of the underlying culture of pessimism, of nihilism, that this is the way in which the government occurs and operates. Is that How does that change? Well, first of all, it can. But is it difficult? Yes. And I think we all know that. First of all, the way of operating, the former way of operating is over 100 years old. That can't be underemphasized. Uh, it's what people's parents, grandparents, etc., lived in. That was the sea in which they swam was that of the political machine. So it becomes something that's passed down in terms of understanding of how things operate within the city. It's embedded in, again, networks and daily practices. I still hear stories from people, not necessarily just in Chester, but in Delaware County, of when getting a job in the school system somewhere in Delaware County in the 1980s, being driven around in a bus and told where the voting booths were and how to vote. So this kind of idea of the significance of the toolkit of the political machine, not formally, but informally, but still nonetheless powerfully, it continued to exist. And so that's it. It shapes people's daily practices, and that I think is important to emphasize. It's you can't just avoid that political machine. You live in it. Where you're going to work, where you're going to go to school, how good your school is going to be. All of that is a not just a relic of the past political machine, but its tentacles that continue to exist, uh, arguably in some degree to the present. So it's self-reinforcing. And it's also, again, like I said, tied to material benefits. What kind of job, what kind of income one can expect. Lastly, the idea of change as being hard is the uncertainty. This is what we know. What's going to come next? uh, Folks are uneasy about the future if they don't know exactly what's going to be occurring. But change does happen, and I've did a little bit of homework on how machines get eventually replaced and how political culture changes. And the first is generational change, and this is what happens in most cities: is that people, there's a lot of influx and outflux of folks moving, and there is a change in typically in leadership. We are seeing that obviously with Mayor Roots and also the Representative Carol Kazim recent real primary reelection. That these are folks that bring fresh blood into a system that do not buy into this kind of normalization of past practices. The other way is institutional reforms, which I think is basically the focus of some of the work that's being done by the receiver's office and the recent ethics policy and things of this nature that kind of, again, formalize efforts to try to undo that past political culture. Then the third is an important one, which is grassroots action, where, again, if political culture is defined as system of government and people's attitudes towards it, then we have to focus on that end of it as well. The crucial role that grassroots organizations, formal and informal, kitchen table ones, as important sometimes as the formal ones, change the norms and expectations of what to expect from their government. And when citizens stop accepting corruption as the way things are, the culture begins to shift. So there's some benefit there in reshaping the norms and expectations. It's hard to measure. It's not, again, not tangible. There isn't a obvious set of rules about what a political culture is defined. But I argue that that's really the issue that is not intractable, but difficult to change. It's the one that has to happen organically. It can't be something that comes externally. So what creates what set of circumstances? Things like this, discussions, conversations, sharing knowledges and resources without some kind of political favor attached to them. The independent community organizations that step in where past government could not. That again gain people's trust, and if that some kind of connection between those organizations and city government can happen, that's a good way of doing it. So the idea here is that the movements don't just resist corruption or fight against it, they cultivate new ideas of what it means to be accountable, what it means to be served, and what is honest governance. So that kind of partnership between formal governance and the third sector of politics, which is really kind of a blurb that kind of rises and falls, is significant, especially in the case of Chester. So just to sum up, that long history and the uniqueness again of the machine spreading into Delaware County, but also kind of inverting the traditional notion of the machine as something that provides favors to its recipients, and basically turning it into a way to pull things out of Chester. Those are stark and very difficult historical factors to overcome. Nonetheless, I think we are seeing that it's possible.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate it. So, Dr. Mann, I do have a couple more questions, but I don't want to hog all the questions. I know we've got other members of the committee. If there were other members of the committee that had questions or comments or wanted to share, again, and I'm not going to try and put anybody on the spot over here. But as someone who's not from Chester, it would be nice to hear from someone who may be from Chester. In terms of what they're seeing or what some of their reactions might be. So, Mayor?
Hey, I'm going to take a little credit right now because when Chris put this book out, it wasn't all over the streets in Chester. There's a young man who was going to school. He's from Chester. He was going to the University of Penn. He saw the book in the bookstore, a U of P bookstore, and I was the blogger at the time, had no interest in politics. But he says, angrily, who is this guy? What is he writing about? I don't know. So we got in touch with Chris and said, Chris, you're going to send me a book. I want to read this book that you wrote. And I read the book. And I can say, just from this conversation today, so many years later, I have to read the book again because now I be reading it with a different lens. I'm listening to him talk in a whole lot differently than I read it, so many years ago. It's a fascinating book. This conversation is really fascinating because I don't think Chris would have ever landed in the city of Chester if it weren't for uh, Chris Rogers and I kind of pulling him into Chester. The book wasn't written with a lot of interviews. It was just a lot of research and his observations on that research, which was, pretty much spot on. But I just have to thank Chris Melee for just hanging with us in this community, being a part of the community, and just being really integral to Chester's history and presenting it in a way that so many others have tried, but you've really brought us up to modern times. There's another book coming out in December that I think picks up where you left off. So all these type of documentations and historical tomes are really important to what we're doing here today. And I just thank you, Chris. This is really great. Let's keep it going.
Yeah. And just and again, folks, feel free to jump in. I mean, one of the things, Chris, that kind of has struck me in Chester, and this is true, I think, for other folks who are again outsiders who come in, but who are experts in their field, right? Who understand municipal distress or school districts or whatever is trying to understand and understand the question of why is Chester so different here, right? Because as we've kind of talked about, right? the the economic trajectory of Chester is not so different than a lot of other communities, right? I mean, there's a lot of cities in Pennsylvania, in New York, right, in Illinois, in Ohio, that have faced economic declines, industrial declines, increased poverty, a lot of those things, but they don't seem to be in the same situation as Chester is in, right? And you get a lot of folks, including me, being like, I've never seen something like this before, and I am sort of searching for the answer because I think in part of that answer is the solution of the work that many of us are trying to do, right? Which is to assist the city and to fade off into the distance, right? And allow the community to continue to run. But trying to understand like why it's so different, right? And what seems to at least appear to me to be that differentiating aspect is what you talked about here, right? This sort of legacy of the machine. And can you talk? I mean, one of the things that also struck me too, Chris, was just like how this was it was self-reinforcing, right? Because when you talk about machines and the work that you do, as you mentioned, like usually machines kind of peter out, right? The top guy dies, right? Everybody fights, and then it falls apart, right? New people come in, but Chester's almost like the Goldilocks, and Delco's almost like the Goldilocks, right? Like it's like Earth, right? It's far enough from the sun, to not be burnt up, but close enough to have life. And it seems like in sort of this strange way, Chester and Delaware County are as well. So can you talk about sort of the self-reinforcing aspect of it? And even though the machine may be gone, how some of those vestiges may still exist today?
Yeah. So, one of the things I didn't mention is that the machine itself and its origins was based in Delaware County, but as primarily transport routes and kind of rural setting, the machine original focus was on rum running and prostitution. The Chester City during the First World War and part of the Second World War, less so, was known as a kind of a honky-tonk atmosphere for gambling, drugs, drinking, especially during Prohibition era, and prostitution. There was a train and then later on a bus that actually ran from the Navy Yard of Philly to Chester City for men to engage in illicit activities. My point here is that the kind of corrupt element is baked into the political machine and also in other municipalities as well. Eventually, those corrupt elements kind of dissipated, and that's, as you mentioned, part of the reason why machines collapse. Their main source of revenue gets cut off. What is somewhat unique about McClureism, that's actually a term, that Mr. McClure was able to find the next best thing. So in essence, the creation of, for example, his manipulating the real estate market in Delaware County, much to the and also his problem with Quaker-based realtors who would not buy into racial segregation. He found a way to consistently be one step ahead of legal changes or changes even in mainstream culture around race relations and things of this nature. He found a way to capitalize on exploitation and a way to kind of again, whether it be exploitation on the basis of things like again running liquor and prostitution and things of that nature, but also in terms of just kind of real estate practices, things of that nature. So that kind of corrupt element remained baked in and remained and but reproduced in different ways. So it didn't die out. It basically found new ways to make money. When we get to the period after Mr. McClure dies, we see a kind of constant continuation of that. You see a lot of I mean, I welcome and I recommend people take a look at. They're available sometimes on in some places online of the Pennsylvania Crime Commission. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission is astounded by the intricacy of how corrupt practices in terms of bail bonds, for example, but also in terms of waste disposal later on, are not sort of peripheral to the everyday operation of government. They are the core. They become the way in which kind of the police, local municipal judges, and bail bonds people kind of created an intricate network. This was their understanding of this is that this is highly developed and highly sophisticated. So the kind of again the unique element, one of the unique elements of Chester is the degree to which that kind of commitment to the machine and its practices of lack of accountability and things of that nature. So this plays out, you know, in we see a little bit of vestiges of this in the current period through some of, for example, the interns that work in either in your office or in Mayor Roots's office. The absence of information about vehicles, the absence of information about what businesses operate in the city. So these were known through patronage. These were known through exchanges. They weren't written down on paper. Well, they might have been, but they certainly weren't preserved. They were probably either taken home by people or burned. But in short, the everyday operation of local government was hyper individualized onto those individuals whose main goal was to reproduce their own power within the local government and reward those outside that help them do so. So this is a powerful way of reproducing a machine, even without a formal machine apparatus. That that thread is consistent 100 years through Chester, and it's somewhat remarkable in that in its scope.
Right. And you also noted too that again that I sort of find interesting too the other self-reinforcing aspect of this is the blame, right? Because what ends up happening is, as I think as you mentioned, is the people are then blamed for this, right? The community is blamed for it, right? By the same people who are extracting from it, and then it just continues, right? Like
Right.
there's this, sort of nostalgia of what Chester has been, right? That folks it always struck it always again as not being from Delaware County and I'm not like has always sort of struck me. I mean, again, certainly, there's the concept of nostalgia, but it seems to sort of be almost in to another degree in this area, and the blame of why I see it sometimes, and again, I wouldn't associate these individuals with sort of the past, but with the kind of idea of you know why are you asking me to bail the city out of stuff that it did to itself, right? For the city's own bad acts. And that's in reading your book and sort of reading the history, like it helps kind of put some of this in perspective, right? Because it does perpetuate, right? Even if you may have, for example, a landlord who's not from the community here that had nothing to do with the Necrellis or the McClures of the world, right? That type of, hey, I can do whatever I want to with my property as long as I'm not caught, attitude um, just perpetuates itself, right? In which case, like, we deal with our staff, right, has to deal with the end results of that, which are often very difficult, to do and very, very entrenched. So, um, any other? So again, I do kind of want to wrap this up if we can. This has been one of our longer M4Acts. We certainly appreciate it, Dr. Melee. We'll love to have you back at some point in a couple months, and you can let us know whether observations, what your observations may be. But at first, I wanted to give any opportunity for any other committee members if they had questions or comments, anything they wanted to add. Feel free if you don't. I don't want to put anyone in the spot.
Yeah,
Yep,
Mr.
Andrew.
Receiver,
Yeah.
just one quick question, and thank you, Dr. Melee. This has been very interesting. I did read your book. I blew through it. Found it very fascinating. Just wanted to circle back to, and I'm very curious about some of the source documents that you said that you used to sort of research the history. Um, I mean, if people wanted to look in the history of Chester, or maybe even some other cities in Pennsylvania, you said the Commission on Crime, the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime, is like a good historical resource. Okay,
Yes.
okay, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah. Most of my material prior to the period prior to 60 came from working in the Delaware County Historical Society. At that time was located in the city of Chester, mostly just sort of in boxes. So I was kind of also helping them out and trying to figure out what they actually owned. But Chester, during its heyday, was an incredibly well-documented community. And I suspect that would be the same for many industrial towns. You had great directories of what manufacturing was there. You had all kinds of reports and publications that came from larger manufactories like Sunship. They did quarterly bulletins that talked about not only production, but who the key actors were. In Chester, as many of you know, when Franklin Roosevelt issued an order that munitions facilities that produce munitions cannot be racially segregated, the Pugh family decided to create a separate yard under the same auspices of Pugh, Sunship, and so it was yard number four. That's amply documented. Also, the NAACP archives spent a lot of time talking about Chester because of the incidences in 63, 64 that made national headlines. The New York Times called Chester the Birmingham of the North. So there's a lot of documentation for that period. As I mentioned earlier, it begins to peter out in the 70s and 80s. It's really relying on at that point the Delaware County Times, with the caveat that it's the Delaware County Times. So that's an issue there. Um, there are some archives that we can't see. Those are housed primarily at Widener University in their libraries, and it's some explanations as to why that's not the case might be that Widener doesn't always come out looking so great in some of those documents, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's really kind of like any city kind of has ebbs and flows with documentation that's out there.
thanks.
Um, just any other comments or questions for Dr. Melee? Well, again, Dr. Melee, we appreciate it. The book is Race and the Politics of Deception, The Making an American City, 2017, from New York University Press. We certainly appreciate the time that you've given us today here and the history lesson. Hopefully, it helps a lot of folks kind of put things into context for folks who've grown up in Chester. Hopefully, it resonates for folks who may not be there. Hopefully, it gives you a little bit more of a perspective. We continue to thank you for all the work you're doing on the community, the Lang Center, and everybody else who's doing great work. I've had the opportunity to speak at a couple of those classroom events, and Dr. Melee's got folks from the community, right? These are people who are from Chester, who've grown up in Chester, And we certainly appreciate the continued focus in here. It is Chester is unique, right? For such a small city, it's got so much literature written about it. Ruling Suburbia is another great example. Other books, the mayor's got a book. Like there's all kinds of there are a lot of lessons here that many of us are continuing to learn. It's an incredibly interesting place and an incredibly unique place as well. So, Dr. Melee, thank you for everything. For the remainder of or for the rest of the MFRAC group, we thank you as well. Our next MFRAC meeting will be June 9th on Tuesday. And again, unless there's anything else, I wish everybody a great day, and we'll see you at the next MFRAC. Bye, everybody.